To get this started for our keynote conversation today, we're going to be joined by the filmmaker Joshua Oppenheimer. 2 years ago, we showed Joshua's first feature-length film, The Act of Killing. Of course, it went on to have enormous impact in Indonesia, where that film is set, where it reflects on the killings that took place in 1965 by interviewing some of the perpetrators of those killings. This was something that in 40 years was not really openly discussed in Indonesia, and the release of that film has begun a conversation that's very historic. Another recognition of that film, it was nominated for an Academy Award this year, and now Joshua is back with a companion film called The Look of Silence. It had its first screening at TIFF yesterday. Just a few days ago, it won the Grand Jury Prize at the Venice Film Festival. So I think it's testament to the power of that film, the recognition that it's getting. Let me bring Joshua out on stage right now, and we'll get started talking. Please welcome Joshua Oppenheimer. So, Joshua, I wanted to kind of go back to before the release of The Act of Killing. You spent 7 years in Indonesia researching this film, making the film, and concurrently making The Look of Silence that we're seeing today. So for anyone in the audience who doesn't know, I should say that since the release of The Act of Killing a couple years ago, you haven't been able to go back to Indonesia. You feel it's not safe for you to go back to Indonesia with some good evidence for that. So the film that we're seeing this week, The Look of Silence, is something that you had filmed. You'd done the filming of it a couple years ago and edited it, always with that intention. So take us back to the beginnings of these films. You know, what were you doing in Indonesia, and how did this project get started?
Well, I first of all, thank you all for coming. It's early, at least it is for me. Thanks, Tom, for the generous introduction. I first went to Indonesia in 2001 to help a community of plantation workers document and to some extent dramatize their struggle to organize a trade union. They were living on a Belgian-owned oil palm plantation. The company was called Société Financière, or simply and somehow ominously, the Financial Society. And they were trying to organize a union in the aftermath of the Suharto dictatorship under which unions were illegal. And when I arrived, I found truly deplorable conditions. I'd never expected to work in Indonesia for 10 years. We thought we'd be there for 6 months and the project would be finished. But the conditions were terrible. The women workers were made to spray a weed killer, an herbicide, with no protective clothing. The mist was getting into their lungs and then into their bloodstreams and then into their livers and destroying their liver tissue and killing them in their 40s. And they were afraid to do very much about it because their parents and grandparents, it turned out, I found out quickly, had been in a strong plantation workers union until 1965 and had been accused of being potential communist sympathizers simply for being in the union, been rounded up and then killed. And they were afraid, of course, this could happen to them again. So you could say that the women I was meeting, the workers I was meeting, were dying because of fear as much as because of poison. And I was very quickly after we made this film together about their struggle to organize a union, they said to me, come back and let's make another film together right away about why we are afraid, about what it's like for us to live with the perpetrators all around us and still in power. What it's like, therefore, for us to live with the fear that this could happen to us again at any time. I went back immediately to start that work in early 2003. And very quickly, very quickly, we began that work, and very quickly the army threatened the survivors not to participate in the film. They got wind of what we had done in the first project we'd made together. It was called the Globalization Tapes, and they threatened the survivors not to continue. The survivors then said, okay, before you quit and give up and go home, try to film the perpetrators. See if they'll tell you how our relatives were murdered, because all they knew was their relatives were taken away and never returned. I was afraid to approach the perpetrators at first. The survivors, particularly Adi and his family, the main characters in the family at the center of The Look of Silence, and Adi is the main character, pointed out to me the closest perpetrators. They were my neighbors, it turned out, in this village. I was afraid to approach them at first, but I found to my horror when I did that all of them were immediately boastful, immediately open about what they'd done, eager to tell recount the most grisly details of the killings with smiles on their faces in front of their families, even in front of their small grandchildren. And generally, immediately after meeting me in their homes, they would invite me to the places they killed and launch into spontaneous demonstrations of how they killed. I had this feeling witnessing that I'd wandered into Germany 40 years after the Holocaust only to find the Nazis still in power. I suppose I could see at once that this boasting was somehow a symptom of impunity, a sign that a way that these men speak because they are in power. When I showed this early material back in 2003, back to the survivors and the Indonesian human rights community as a whole, everybody, but perhaps no one more eloquently and forcefully than Adi, the main character in The Look of Silence, said, continue filming the perpetrators, because anybody who sees this in Indonesia or outside Indonesia will be forced to acknowledge what's wrong today, what's happening today, that these men are still, what are the consequences of their impunity today, and they'll see just from the way they speak why all the survivors are so afraid. So I then felt entrusted to do a work, if you like, that an Indonesian, let alone a survivor, certainly couldn't do by herself. And I spent 2 years filming every perpetrator I could find across the region from 2003 to 2005, working my way up the chain of command gradually, from the countryside to the city.
Can I just ask you about that? So you filmed, I think, 40 perpetrators.
Before I met Anwar Congo, before I started making the act of killing, I filmed 40 perpetrators.
Anwar Congo is the main figure in the act of killing. As you were filming these 40 perpetrators, were you thinking of these interviews as an archive for history, or were you thinking this as research? I'm looking for a character for a film. How much did you imagine what you were doing then was going to turn into a feature-length documentary?
It was an investigation, an exploration, an excavation, but I always knew it was for a film. If you think of what Adi and the other survivors said, they were saying, make a film out of this, don't make an academic archive, make a film out of this, and this will hold a mirror up to Indonesia and to, indeed, as I sort of hope, to the whole world. The reason I say the whole world is one of the scenes that was sort of the genesis for me, where everything gelled of both films, The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, is a scene in The Look of Silence, which actually comes several times over the course of the film, where two death squad leaders who didn't know each other, hardly knew each other, take me down to a riverbank, to a clearing on a river where they helped kill 10,500 people with their own hands. And as they take me down to that spot, they take turns playing victim and perpetrator, gleefully reenacting what they've done. And at the end, they stop to pose for they want to take snapshots to commemorate their happy day out. For me, it was one of the worst days of my life, filming that scene. And at the end, they take these snapshots of them posing, giving the thumbs up, the V for victory, in the spot where 10,500 people have been murdered, a number of them by their own hands. And that was in January 2004 that I shot that scene, somewhere pretty early, halfway between when I started filming perpetrators and when I first met Anwar Congo, the protagonist of The Act of Killing, or the main character in The Act of Killing. And I came back to England, where I was living at the time, really upset, really, you could even say a little traumatized by that experience of filming this. And then in the spring of 2004, photographs of American soldiers in Iraq giving the thumbs up at least and smiling in sites of torture while they appeared to be torturing people, appeared in the world's media. And the pivotal question that sort of gelled in sort of crystallized in my mind at that moment was not so much the crimes that may have been taking place around the photographs in Abu Ghraib, and not so much the crimes that happened 40 years ago in Indonesia, but the moral vacuum in which those photographs are being taken. Why, in what society, in what culture could these photographs be conceived as souvenirs bearing happy memories? And that was somehow, it was an attempt to understand that would lead to the act of killing, and an attempt to understand how on earth do the survivors continue to live? What does it mean for them? What does it do to them, to their families, to relationships, to the love they have for each other, to their memories, to their bodies, to their souls, to have to rebuild a life in such a moral vacuum, in the shadow of the people who killed their relatives? That would lead to the look of silence. Now, as I filmed more and more perpetrators, eventually I met Anwar Congo. The first day of filming with him was very much like the first day of filming with everybody else. He invites me to a spot where he's killed hundreds of people. It's a roof terrace. He does, unlike some people, he thinks to bring along a friend to play a victim, and he thinks to bring along a prop, a weapon to use as a prop, in this case a length of wire and a piece of wood. That wasn't particularly unusual. And if any of you have seen The Act of Killing, of course I'm referring to the early scene in the film where Anwar Congo takes me to the rooftop and demonstrates how he killed. But what was unusual in that scene was the way Anwar then says to forget all of this, to erase the trauma of all of this, the horror of all of this, so I wouldn't go crazy. I would go out drinking and taking drugs and dancing, and then he says, and look, I'm a good dancer. And he proceeds to dance in the spot where he killed 1,000 people, perhaps. And he does it as though almost to banish in that moment, by dancing in the present, in front of my camera, to banish the pain that he'd just acknowledged, that he'd just spoken of. And I had this feeling, having now filmed 40 people before him, perpetrators before him, I had this feeling that perhaps I'd misunderstood or hadn't yet understood part of what's motivating this boasting. I'd understood that the boasting serves to terrorize all of the perpetrators' neighbors. If they're talking like this with their own grandchildren, why not talk about this with their neighbors? And that, of course, they become frightening to their neighbors, and that keeps people afraid and subdued and suppressed. But the boasting I also saw here was somehow a way of banishing a pain. And I started to wonder whether perhaps these men are not as proud as they appear to be. Perhaps these men know at some level, as they must if they're human, which I take it as axiomatic that they are human. Of course they're human. Every human being is human. If they're human, they must know at some level it was wrong. And yet somehow, or at least they must be affected deeply by it. And yet to somehow avoid having to deal with their conscience, to avoid having to deal with their guilt so that they can live with themselves, they boast. They insist that it's heroic. The memories that are precisely most troubling. So you get this peculiar combination of grisly detail delivered with cheer, or apparent cheer. To explore that, I spent 5 years working with Anwar and his friends, trying to understand how victors write history, how they tell stories to justify what they've done, how they impose that on a whole society, the political, the economic effects of that on a whole society. I did this work in collaboration with survivors and human rights activists, as well as the whole Indonesian crew of filmmakers. And the method actually was very simple and recursive over those 5 years. We would shoot one scene, starting with that first scene on the roof. I would play it back to the perpetrators in the scene, ask them to respond, and tell me what they wanted to do next. And that organically and gradually led to the kind of surreal heights with which the film culminates.
Let me ask you this. There are audience members who really took a strong dislike to the fact that you were giving a platform to killers. How did how did you react to that negative reaction of the film?
Well, it's very simple. I didn't give a platform to killers. A platform is something like this, where I can come up here and say whatever I like. In fact, it'd be more of a platform if you weren't here, Tom, and I could say whatever I like and you guys could walk out or not, but you don't have a microphone. That's a platform. These men never had control over their footage and knew they wouldn't have control over the footage. I maintained editorial control, of course. They're never making a separate film of their own. That would be a platform, but they aren't. So in the end, the film that comes of this project, The Act of Killing, one can look at its effect, one can ask what it does to audiences. I don't think there's a single viewer, including the people who have raised that objection, I don't think there's a single viewer who come away from that film saying that these men look heroic, that this film justifies what they've done in any way. Inside Indonesia, the film's been widely distributed by human rights groups, survivors organizations. It's screened thousands of times across the country. It's helped to catalyze sort of the opening of a space. It's catalyzed really a transformation, you could say, or at least helped to catalyze a transformation in how the country talks about its past. It's led the mainstream media in Indonesia to finally talk about the genocide as a genocide, and to talk about the genocide's terrible legacy. I suppose my response would be the country, its media, its political system. That's the killer's platform. And the film is something that comes in and subverts that platform, that makes the lies the killers have been telling subsequent generations of Indonesians, survivors, it makes those lies untenable.
I want to ask a mundane question because we have so many filmmakers in the audience. Over the 7 years that you were working on this project, what was sustaining you?
Well, at the start, it was a kind of, I began this project with the first 2 years of filming The Perpetrators, some of that footage appears in The Look of Silence, but not in The Act of Killing. The material from 2003 to 2005, I was actually doing a PhD and had a fellowship to do it. And that sort of kept me going on a very low level. Then we gathered together small arts grants from 2005 to 2007 to allow the first stages of shooting with Anwar and his friends. And then in 2007, we were able to get an academic grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the United Kingdom on the basis of the previous 4 years of work that would allow us to start really shooting the film and the core of the film. And then I met the producer of the film, Sina Berg-Sørensen. If she's here, she's just the most important, I think, documentary producer alive right now. She's there.
I have to interject that about 2 weeks ago, I was at a documentary conference in Denmark where Sine got an award, and you could just see the admiration in that room in the Danish documentary community for her. So it was really pleasing to be there.
So Sina met me and said, Sina saw a presentation by one of my colleagues of some of the material we were shooting and asked him, who's the producer on this film? And the fact was we didn't have any producer on the film, but we really needed one. We had a lot of footage and a long way to go. And Sina invited me to Denmark to meet her. I was in Indonesia at the time shooting, but I went to Denmark and began a really wonderful collaboration with Sina, with our production company there, of which I'm now a partner with Sina. And the whole Danish, it's called Final Cut for Real. And then the whole Danish documentary sort of community, but especially, of course, the Danish Film Institute. That would actually lead me subsequently when I went to edit The Act of Killing in Denmark to relocate to Denmark. But Sina was able to raise the support necessary to finish the film in a really thoughtful and careful, good way. I mean, by the end, we had 1,200 hours of footage if you take the two films together. There was 3 years of editing, the first year and a half with two younger editors working side by side, and then a year and a half of two very senior editors working in succession, one for about a year on the 2-hour and 40-minute unabridged version of the film. which here in Canada and the United States, I guess, is available in the US on Netflix and iTunes and DVD and Blu-ray, but here soon to be on all of those platforms, but maybe at the moment only on DVD and Blu-ray. I think in October it comes out everywhere else. The longer cut. So then we had another 6 months of editing, a 2-hour theatrical cut, which is what we screened here in TIFF, and then a 95-minute broadcast version with another editor. So it was a really long process, and it was a testament to Sina's skill that she was able to raise the resources for us to do it really well, and also to sustain ourselves and not go bankrupt while doing it, while at the same time maintaining total creative freedom over every cut of the film.
During this process, I feel like you made some very deliberate and smart choices, not least of all aligning yourself with Sina. But you had reached out to Errol Morris and Werner Herzog and gotten their interest in the film, so that by the time I must say it was the first time I'd ever received notes of recommendation from both of them for a film. Can you talk about that kind of process of building support for what you were doing before the film had even been seen by a festival programmer?
Well, it was a hard film to explain and to pitch. And as a pitch, it sounded even more, I think as a pitch, before anyone could see the film, it could sound, that's when we would get a lot of these ethical questions. I remember Mr. Nick Fraser, the BBC Storyville commissioning editor, who actually most prominently put in writing the criticism to which you referred earlier. He saw the material that would go into The Look of Silence, which is a film about survivors. His objection to The Act of Killing is that it's a film about perpetrators, but he saw the footage that would go into the film about survivors, and said, despite the fact that he now says he wants a film about survivors, or would have liked a film about survivors, his comment was unforgettable. It was, "I do not want my strand awash with atrocity." So, of course, I remember it, because those are so eloquently put. I do not want my strand awash with atrocity. So finding support for the film was difficult, and to do that, we then would have to look for people who we thought might resonate with it. Errol and Werner were two of those people. The British executive producer of the film, Andre Singer, is a wonderful man in every way, and has a wonderful film out now, as Night Will Fall, I think it's called. It's a beautiful film about the Holocaust. But he also produces and executive produces Werner's, he produces some of Werner's documentaries, and introduced me to Werner after we had a cut of the longer version of the film, and Werner immediately responded and has been a very good friend to the film, and then to me, and to now The Look of Silence ever since. Errol I knew through people in Boston, where I went to college, and introduced me to him, and Errol was also very excited, having seen a selection of scenes.
I want to talk a little bit about The Look of Silence. You've talked about Adi, who's at the center of this film, and for people who haven't seen the film, there are some very dramatic scenes of Adi confronting the killers of his brother. And he was able to do that because you, through your filmmaking process, had identified who these killers were. And so I want to ask you about, being an outsider in this place where it's now dangerous for you to be in Indonesia, but you can leave Indonesia, and working along someone like Adi, who's at much more risk. It's a question about how the responsibility you take for your subjects.
Well, first of all, it would never have occurred to me to propose to Adi that we should meet the perpetrators together with Adi. Adi spent after I started filming the perpetrators in 2003, Adi would watch with fascination, with curiosity, with devastation, whatever we had to show him, whatever we had time to show him. And in a way, the look of silence as a title refers to his face as he watches and hears about how his brother, his other relatives, and the people in his community were murdered from the perpetrators themselves, who remain his neighbors. And he watched, then when I started filming with Anwar Congo and making the act of killing over those 5 years of shooting, he continued to want to see as much as we had time for. When I went back to make The Look of Silence after we edited The Act of Killing, but before it premiered here at TIFF, Adi said, I didn't know that Adi would be the main character of the film, but I knew I would start discussing the film with his family. We got together and Adi said, you know what I want to do? I don't want to continue gathering survivors together to talk about what they went through. I want to do something else now that I think will show even better what it's like for us to live in this situation as survivors. I want to meet the perpetrators. I want to see if they'll acknowledge that what they did to me, and I want to see if they'll acknowledge that it was wrong once they know that I'm the human being whose brother they killed. And I think what Adi was hoping for was that he would be able to separate, if they could acknowledge it was wrong, he could separate the person, the human being who committed the crime, from the crime itself, and actually forgive the human being so that he and the perpetrators could live together side by side as human beings instead of side by side as perpetrator and victim, and thereby hopefully lift his family out of the trap of fear and ensuing silence under which they'd been stuck for so many decades. I think that was his hope. He fails in that hope in the sense that none of the perpetrators have the courage to acknowledge what they did is wrong, even when confronted with him. One daughter does. She's able to say, she's able to very gracefully and with real dignity apologize on her father's behalf. But this was an unimaginable thing for a survivor to confront a perpetrator. It would never have occurred to me to propose it. I think it's unimaginable, or it's certainly maybe not unimaginable, it's unprecedented, I think, in the history of documentary film. There's many documentary films where survivors meet perpetrators and try and begin a dialogue, but I can't think of a single title where they do so while the perpetrators are still entirely in power. Here, because it's dangerous. So once Adi proposed that, we had to think very hard, could we do this safely, and what could we do? How could we do it to protect the family's safety, should that be necessary? We worked 6 months. There were all sorts of steps we took to make sure the shoots themselves were as safe as possible. But over the last 6 months, we've worked very closely with the family to relocate them to a safer part of Indonesia, out from the isolation of North Sumatra, out from under the shadow of the perpetrators who remain in power and continue to terrorize families like Adi's and Adi's family as well, into a much more supportive community of writers, artists, activists, and also to make it possible for them to leave so that they're not actually stuck there. We're hopeful. One of the calculations that makes me hopeful that this would be safe for them is that many of the highest ranking perpetrators in the act of killing awaited with, I'm sure, anxiety, anxiously awaited the arrival of my next film to see if they're in it, thinking, oh no, there's more coming. And I'm sure they will breathe a sigh of relief when they see the new film, because they'll see, oh, they're not in it. And the only perpetrators in it are powerful locally in North Sumatra. But these men, the most powerful perpetrators, who may feel as though they've got off the hook in the second film, are unlikely to stick their necks out on behalf of some provincial power brokers who have little national influence. So that was one calculation. The other is that I think because of Adi's dignity, his gentleness, his empathy, the film provides a model for how reconciliation can happen, even if Adi fails as a one-person Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think Truth and Reconciliation inevitably requires wholesale social change before it can really happen. It provides a model, but it also provides a portrait, I hope a quite lyrical one, about how urgently truth and reconciliation is needed.
We just have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask a question about the your visual approach to these films. Both films are full of striking images. It's clear that it's not something that you take lightly. Can you talk about the images that you're putting on screen?
I somehow feel in all my films or in both of these films, and I'm sure in whatever in my future films, that I want to give you I want to immerse you in a world. In The Act of Killing, it's the sort of phantasmagoria of Anwar's, of the stories and fantasies that Anwar, the killers, the regime as a whole tell to justify what they've done, so that it becomes a nightmare as the film unfolds, a kind of fever dream in which we get lost. And in The Look of Silence, I want to immerse you in the silence and the fear that this one family, and I want you to be very, very intimate with them. This one family has been forced to, in which this one family has been forced to live. I want you to feel what silence and decades of fear do to a human body, what it does to skin, what it does to eyes, what it does to hands, what it does to the way people speak, the way people look, the way people hesitate to say what most needs to be said. And I think to do that immersion, I think, involves making films that really don't feel like observational documentaries at all in some way, but rather are kind of lyrical, hopefully lyrical, visual kind of concentrations or condensations of the essence, of a kind of essence. So all the while when I'm shooting, I'm looking for visual images, metaphors that strike the core of what this world is in which I want to immerse you.
If you haven't seen The Look of Silence yet, I hope you will make time at 6 p.m. today to go see it. We're so proud to have shown The Act of Killing. We're so proud to have shown The Look of Silence. I deeply appreciate you making the time to be here with us this morning. We're going to take a 50-minute break, and then we'll be back with Alanis Obomsawin and Sturla Gunnarsson. Please stick around.
Thank you.